everyone, and welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Phil.
And I'm Pat.
Today, we're going to be talking about communication. Communication isn't the most important part of any good relationship. It's also critical to playing Airsoft. As we said on many episodes before, Airsoft is a team sport. And communication is critical in making sure that your team is as organized as possible when you're hitting the field. Communication is at its very core about passing information from one person to another person, ideally to request aid or to inform them of stuff that is going to be important for their decision making on the field. Today we want to dive into the three core ways that airsofters communicate on the field: by hand signals, by talking, and by using radios. We're going to start off by just very briefly glossing over what good communication is all about, right? Regardless of the method that you're using, as I said at the start, you're really trying to pass information from yourself to someone else, or on the flip side, receive information from another player, right?
And as is often the case, we really want to try here to provide you with sort of insight into stuff we've done that worked and stuff we've done that didn't work at all, so that you can avoid making some of the mistakes we've already made.
Yeah, so in other words, we're trying to communicate with you to provide you useful information. And when you're thinking about communication overall, regardless of what method you're going to use, there's a few things that you need to take into consideration. Firstly, the information that you're going to pass on should be clear, right? When you are saying something to someone else, whether it's with a hand signal or over the radio or just by talking at them, what you're saying should be clear, right?
Yeah, metaphor is not terribly helpful here. You know, if I say, Jeremy, pass me the coconuts, and Jeremy has no idea what I mean, that's not terribly useful.
At a more simple and realistic level, however, if you're using hand signals that someone else doesn't understand, that's not helpful. If you're using abbreviations that other players don't know, that's not helpful either. And in Airsoft in particular, we take a lot of our inspiration from military and law enforcement, who have a lot of acronyms and a lot of terms for very specialized things. But if people on your team aren't familiar with those, then you can create confusion by using them. So for example, if Pat calls me on the radio and says, "Hey Phil, can you come to my position?" and I reply saying, affirmative, "I'm Oscar Mike," and he doesn't know what Oscar Mike means, then he's going to turn around and say, so are you coming or not?
Yeah, the fact that you've watched every episode of Generation Kill 17 times probably means you've picked up a specific sort of idiom of quasi-military language, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the people on your team have any idea what you're saying, which can be really unhelpful. Right.
And that applies whether you're talking over voice, whether you're talking over radio, or whether you're using hand signals. So starting off with hand signals, you can go online and you can see like a myriad of like just grids full of different hand signals, like 30 or 40 different SWAT team hand signals. One for, there's an enemy up, there's an enemy down, cover me, hold, stop. He's using a submachine gun, there's the dog, like all kinds of different stuff. And if you are trying to memorize all of them, then that's great, but chances are the people on your team might not have them memorized, and the random people who you are playing with at the airsoft field, they definitely don't know all these hand signals.
Yeah, there's a very limited chance of them having memorized them. And also, in terms of hand signals you're trying to figure out using for your team or for yourself, it's not really useful to learn "there's a dog" for airsoft, because there never should be.
There are definitely situations where you are going to want to communicate silently with a teammate in order to coordinate your movement. But in Airsoft, the breadth of things that we need to communicate silently is relatively small. Like Pat said, there shouldn't be a dog on the field. If there is, you probably should stop play.
Yeah, and you should be doing so loudly, not quietly.
Absolutely. So what are you going to want to do? Well, you're going to want to say how many enemies you see or how many enemies you hear. You're going to want to communicate to your teammate whether you want to move or whether they should move, whether you need cover or whether they will provide cover. You may want to communicate the route that you're going to take, which way you're going to go. These are things that you can do very simply with hand signals. And if you plan on utilizing hand signals with your teammates, whether they're your structured team, like a Storm Riders team, or whether they're the teammates that you're paired with that day, Just take a couple minutes before the game and agree on what the different hand signals will mean.
And keep it simple, right? If you're playing a 30-minute skirmish in Airsoft, the maximum number of hand signals you're probably going to need are stop, hostiles, and cover me. Like, you don't need to break out a 40 hand signal chart and start handing it around.
Yeah, it should be pretty straightforward. So for example, you could hold up the number of fingers for how many enemies you see. Or you could hold up the same number of fingers but point to your ears to show how many enemies you hear. You want to be covered, you can wave your hand over your head in a flat way and say, cover me, and point to yourself. Or you can do the same thing and point to the other player to say, I will cover you. Very simple mechanisms like this are a good way to communicate silently in a clear and concise way. If you hold up 2 fingers, generally speaking, it's assumed that you are pointing to the number of players, enemy players that you observed, right? If you look at your buddy and you hold up 2 fingers, likely they're not going to think, oh, he's counting both of us, me and him. It's like, no, he's counting other things outside of our sphere.
Yeah, and, in most Airsoft games, your teammate's not going to go, oh, I assume that means there are 2 tanks over there. Like, the contextual information is pretty solid.
Right. So when it comes to hand signals, keep them simple. So simple gestures, things that you don't need to do like 3 different things with your hands. It's very straightforward. Keep them limited. Talk to your team ahead of time and agree on what you're going to use. And in doing so, you'll be able to make sure that everyone's on the same page and no one is confused by what's going on if you're using hand signals to talk.
Try to keep them also as much as possible to gestures you can make with one hand so that you can make them while you are holding your rifle.
Absolutely. So that's hand signals. And in our experience, playing Airsoft for the last 14 years, I haven't used hand signals that much. Most of the time, I'm in a situation where I'm engaged in a firefight with somebody else. They know where I am. I know where they are. There's really not a whole lot of need to be quiet. Does it happen? Absolutely it does. But most Airsoft games that I've played, I will use my voice rather than use my hands to communicate. Mostly because I'm using my hands to shoot the other people.
I mean, the majority of the hand signals we've used in the entire time I've been playing Airsoft are like, yeah, okay, hold up a fist means stop, hand flat over my head means cover, point at me, point at you. And, if I'm holding up a number of fingers, you can assume that's guys around the corner from us.
Yeah.
Other than that, there aren't that many situations in Airsoft where you need sort of silence to magnify surprise like a SWAT team does, right? They have a complicated set of hand signals, but A, they have all day, every day to learn them. And B, they're actually extremely utilitarian for what they're doing. But that's typically because people aren't generally aware of where they are or what's about to happen to them. And so talking is a big risk for them. Frankly, in Airsoft, 90% of the time, you can get by with whispering and you'll be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Outside of hand signals, you're going to use your voice to communicate. When it comes to voice communication and communication in general, it's not something that everyone is really good at sort of out of the box, so to speak. It's a skill that you learn, that you need to practice, and there's a couple of fundamental things that everyone needs to remember when it comes to communication. We have referred to them in previous videos, but basically we call them the ABCs of communication. ABC in this case is an acronym, and it stands for accuracy, brevity, and clarity. So when you are going to communicate to anybody on the field, you're going to strive for those 3 things. Obviously, you want to make sure that the information that you are passing on to other players is accurate, right? You don't want to say to someone, hey, there's 5 guys over there when there's 10, or when there's 7, or there's 2. So it's not just about knowing the information, but in some cases, it's making sure that the information you're passing is correct. Double check, right? Before you say 5, is it actually 5? Yeah. Take a second and make sure that the information is correct.
Take a second to look again to confirm the information you're passing to your team, especially if you're playing like a milsim game and you're passing it to a commander who's then going to make decisions about shifting forces on the field or whatever. And be aware that the difference between 5 guys or 2 guys and 10 guys is extremely important, especially with games that aren't 100 people on a side. This is not a place for you to engage in hyperbole, right? Shouting, oh God, there's 15 of them over there, or there's 200 of them over there, is not useful to anyone. Take a second to calm down, take a breath, look again. Okay, there are 4 of them. Great. Communicate that you're taking effective fire, if you're taking effective fire, but don't communicate that, oh God, it feels like there are hundreds of them shooting at us. A, that doesn't help your teammates' morale, and B, it doesn't pass accurate information.
Mm-hmm. It sort of ties into the second point, which is B, which stands for brevity, right? So yeah, the information you're going to pass is going to be accurate, so it's going to be good info, but you want to communicate it then in a way that is brief. So obviously, a podcast is not the best example of brief communication, right? We're communicating information to you over the course of half an hour. The reality is when we're playing Airsoft, time is of the essence in almost every single case. As the meme says, ain't nobody got time to be sitting around, right? We need to make sure that the message we're passing is being done in a short way. So we want to be brief. So instead of saying there are 5 enemy soldiers, they are 200 meters away, I think that they are shooting at me, but I'm not really sure. I think at least one of them spotted me, but I think 4 of them haven't yet. That's all fine and good, and that's all accurate information perhaps, but it doesn't pass the brevity test. What do you need to communicate? What is the essential component of your message?
Yeah, you need to think about whether or not what you're passing is useful and condense it down as much as possible, right? Your stream of consciousness might be interesting, but it's not helpful, strictly speaking. I'm a teacher. I communicate with people for a living, but I communicate with students in my classes in longhand, whereas on the airsoft field, and this took a lot of learning for me because I'm naturally a pretty verbose guy, it's much more effective for me to go, all right, 4 contacts, right side, 100 meters, than it is to add any more information there. If one of them is carrying a HPA LMG, I might go, oh yeah, LMG, 4 guys, right side, 400 meters, moving left to right.
On the flip side, you can look at how the American military or the Canadian military do their reporting and their contact reporting and stuff. And you'll find that it is brief, but it is way, way overcomplicated for what we need for airsoft purposes. For one thing, as we've said many times before, we're engaging at ranges that are much, much shorter. I mean, you're going to be within 100 meters of another player. An 8-line report on their position and their makeup and all this kind of stuff is a very limited use and applicability in a normal airsoft game, even a milsim.
Yeah, you'd have to be a pretty humongous milsim game with a whole lot of additional moving parts for that to be particularly useful to a commander. Partly because of, like Phil said, the range is so short by comparison, and partly because unless you're playing the kind of airsoft game that, I mean, I'd love to play it, but don't really believe happens very much, like, there are no attack helicopters coming to provide you with support by fire.
Absolutely,
right?
Exactly. So you want to be accurate, you want to be brief, and then you want to be clear. Right? And what we mean by clarity is that the information that you're passing along is not ambiguous. So Patrick said earlier, there's 4 guys, right side, 100 meters. That is very clear to me. What he's telling me is how many people are engaging him, from what direction, at what distance. That is the kind of information that we want to pass on. It's information that when you hear it, you do not need to ask follow-up questions to understand what you were just told. So if you're talking on the radio and someone says to you, I'm being engaged by 3 guys. Okay, cool. So like, where are they shooting at you from? Where are you? Right? How far away are they? Like, there's a lot of information that I need as a follow-up, and so that's not a good message.
Yeah.
And that is something that we see a lot, is people communicate on the radio, and they'll say, yeah, I'm under fire. Well, bully for you, but unfortunately, you've told me literally nothing that I need to know in order to be able to help you.
And then the player who's saying, oh god, I'm taking fire on the radio is firstly filling up our comm lane with information that's not helpful to us or to them. Secondly, they're going to get frustrated when no help arrives. But ultimately, and this is a thing I think everyone on our team, except probably Karoo, because, professional reasons, has struggled with, is just, yeah, I'm asking you for help and you're not giving me any. Well, I can't give you any help if you give me no information that allows me to help you.
Yeah. And whether you're doing that over the radio or whether you're shouting, you need to make sure that what you're asking and what you're saying is very clear. It's not ambiguous. It doesn't require a follow-up statement. So let's say you're not on the radio. Let's say you are within shouting range of your friendlies. You could say, I need help on the right side 100 meters. Okay, well then people will hear you. They will know where you are, more or less, so they know what you mean when you say right side. They know what you mean when you say 100 meters, and they can take action to come help you. If I'm behind cover and I hear my teammates say, I'm under fire, my first question will be, where's it coming from? Because I'm not coming out of cover if he's under fire, if I don't know where he's being attacked from.
Yeah, I mean, if I shout, I'm taking fire, and Phil has no idea where I am or where that fire is coming from, then he'd be crazy to get up and look around because he's probably going to take fire.
Exactly.
Which is not going to help me or him.
So then the question becomes, how can you be accurate, brief, and clear every time? Does it take a lot of practice? Is it a skill that you're going to take years to master? The answer is not really. So it does take some practice, but more than practice, you just need to think about what you say before you actually say it. And as people, we don't tend to work that way. Most people, it's like boom, 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 right away. As soon as you think something, it's coming out of your mouth. When it comes to communication, it pays to take a second or a minute to think about what exactly you need to communicate before you say it. So as an example, we are having these podcasts, which we are recording and we are sharing with you. Patrick and I are spending some time before every podcast to think about what it is that we want to say. What are our talking points? What are the things that we want to communicate? What are some of the things that we don't want to say? And in some cases, as you can imagine, these podcasts are edited. So there are parts that we have removed because they didn't convey what we wanted to say, and we've then said it again. It is very important to take time to make sure that what you're going to say is going to be accurate, it's going to be brief, and it's going to be clear to the person that you're communicating with.
Not only that, but we're also taking time before we start these to have a little sort of rundown before each episode to give us an idea of what we're going through. And so this is a skill to practice both before games in terms of like, hey, everyone I'm playing with, remember, keep it concise. Take a second before you talk into the mic on your radio, before you shout to me, to actually parse the information together so that it's in a small, useful packet. You don't want to be just talking stream of consciousness. That works great having, a pint at the pub with your friends after the game. But on the field, it's not helpful. So one thing I want to mention also is that you should be unafraid to be loud on the airsoft field in terms of communicating information to your teammates once contact with the enemy has been established, right? Once the firefight is on, your enemy knows where you are. So be loud. Tell me where you are so that I have the same information that the hostile force does, right? You don't need to be quiet, so yell it out so that everyone on the team can hear you. Yell it out clearly, right? Keep it brief, keep it concise, but make sure that everyone can hear what's going on, because that way you're giving useful information and you're not really giving anything up. Like, people often think, oh man, in order to be tactical while I'm playing airsoft, I have to be really quiet, right? So, oh yeah, we've engaged, but I'm still going to be really quiet. Well, once you're shooting, you're being loud with, your gun. So everyone knows where you are. So you're not gaining any benefit by being quiet. You're not gaining any stealth, right? So if you're shouting, if you don't have radio communication with everyone on your team, belt it out. If you do have radio communication with people on your team, speak loudly and clearly into the microphone. You don't want to shout into your comms if possible. I would prefer to avoid that because I like having my hearing. But you don't need to try to whisper into your comms unless you're in a situation where you're in cover and the enemy doesn't know where you are and they're walking right by and you want to pass information.
Yeah, we often hear, oh, but Phil, if I start yelling, the enemy will hear me and they'll be able to accommodate for that on the field and stuff. I ask you, how many times on the field have you listened to what your opponents were saying while you were engaged with them in a firefight and used that information to change your tactics? I would be willing to bet not very often. Now, I've had lots of times where I've been sneaking and the enemy is unaware of my presence and I'm not engaging and I have overheard conversations and I have passed that information along. That is absolutely true, but this is not what we're talking about. In a situation where I'm actively engaged with the enemy, so they are shooting at me and I am shooting at them, it is very, very seldom that I can actually hear what they are saying to each other in a way that enables me to make changes on the field. It can sometimes happen, but 80% of the time, at the very least, they don't hear what I'm saying. They hear that I'm talking, but they are not hearing the specifics, nor do I hear the specifics of what they're saying either. So you shouldn't be afraid of passing that information on to your teammates and shouting and telling them what you need in a clear and concise way to try and get an edge on the field.
And honestly, if you're shouting pat, flank, right at me, and they do hear pat and right, just they get the basic piece of information, that's only going to help them if they can, in fact, react to what you've just told me to do before it causes problems for them.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in ways that actually prevent it from causing problems to them, right? So if the enemy is dug in a position and my teammates are firing on them and they're stuck where they are, and Phil says, Pat, flank right, they hear Pat's flanking right. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to get up and prevent me from flanking them. Like, it's telegraphed, yes, but it's not telegraphed in a way that allows them to respond and counter the threat. It's just they have information about what bad thing is about to happen to them.
And again, that's assuming they not only hear what was said, but also understand it. And as I said before, 8 times out of 10, they hear you talking, but they don't hear what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, they've got rounds hitting cover around them. They've got the sound of their guns going. They've got the sound of our guns going. Like, airsoft is a noisy thing. And, as we talked about in our last episode, you know, your brain is trying to do a lot of stuff during any given firefight, right? So your brain is trying to, hopefully as automatically as possible, run the shooting aspect of things. It's trying to visualize the field, think about what's going on, think about how I can move, how I can be useful, what I can change, what I can influence. But the net result of that is that there's not that much processing power available for listening to what Phil just said when Phil is 50 feet away from you shooting at you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about hand signals. We talked about the fundamentals of communication, accuracy, brevity, clarity. We talked a little bit about yelling on the field or shouting on the field. And we've also, throughout this so far, talked about utilizing a radio to communicate. It goes without saying that if you are playing airsoft, you should be using a radio. Obviously, if you're playing a CQC field that's the size of a postage stamp and that's all you're doing, that's one thing. But for the types of games that we play, which are milsim adjacent, objective-based games, you need to be using a radio. You need to have a radio, you need to carry it. Ideally, you need to have some sort of PTT or an earpiece to keep that radio quiet so that you can have one and still be able to be stealthy if you need to. But as far as we're concerned, a radio is an essential piece of kit. Before we go any further, there are radios out there that have been used for airsoft that are not, strictly speaking, legal to use without a permit. In Canada, if we think about, for example, the typical Baofeng radios, in Canada, it is illegal to use those without specific certification.
And the certification is not terribly expensive or difficult to get, mind you.
No, but you can still get those radios and you can still use them. However, you need to understand that if you use a Baofeng programmable radio or any sort of those types of radios, that is not a particular class of device in Canada, and I do believe in the United States as well, they're considered ham radios, and you don't have a license, you are doing so illegally. So just before we go any further, I think it's important to clarify that. You can get extremely good performance from regular sort of over-the-counter walkie-talkie radios that are good enough for airsoft purposes, that can take a headset. They can either take like an earpiece or PTT or whatever, and they will give you all the same functionality. The only thing you're not getting is the programmability and like the super, super long ranges and stuff. But for airsoft, they're absolutely fine. So we just want to put that up front. We're not sponsored by Baofeng or anyone else to talk about this, clearly, but it's really worth considering that there are lots of good radio options out there available. A lot of them are not very expensive, but it's definitely a piece of kit that you need to pick up. And if you're picking one up, make sure that you're picking one up that you are A, legally allowed to use, and B, is going to fit your particular play area and stuff.
I mean, I will say, if you're playing in a larger field, you may want something sort of a little better than the Costco Cobra Radio 2-pack for playing in your backyard. They're not going to be quite up to snuff, but you can definitely buy a pretty good walkie-talkie style radio for like $40-50 that will have all the range you really, practically speaking, need. But it's also really important to note that these things are tremendously useful for every game size, right? 5v5 team deathmatch, being able to communicate effectively with your team when they're not within line of sight of you without shouting is great. When they're outside of earshot, being able to communicate with them is incredible. It changes the way in which your team can operate. It changes the way in which you can move and fight effectively.
So if you are listening to this and you don't have a radio, highly recommend that you go out and buy one. Like Pat said, they're not tremendously expensive. It will make a tremendous difference to your team's ability to maneuver on the field. Now, a critical piece of having that radio, though, is making sure that you have some sort of headset, PTT, etc., to make sure that you can utilize it in situations where you want to be quiet. So there have been situations for me where my radio has gone down and I've had to use like a loaner or something like that. And the radio that I was given didn't have a plug that was compatible with my earpiece. So I had to use it just with the speaker and the radio. And that was a huge problem because I'd store it on my kit. And then if I needed to sneak, I had to turn the volume way down or I needed to turn it off completely. And then I might as well not have a radio. So if you pick up a radio, you absolutely need to go and make sure that you can get an earpiece that will fit or a PTT or headset that will work with that particular radio. One very important part that everyone needs to remember is that there is a delay between the time that you push the push to talk or you push the button on your radio and that it starts actually picking up what you're saying. So when you're communicating on the radio, always hold your push to talk down first, you wait for a second, and then you start talking. And you do the same thing at the end. You stop talking, and then you release your push-to-talk after. This is to make sure that you don't clip off the first part or the last part of your message. It's very, very important, and it's probably the mistake we see most commonly is people always get the front part of their message because they push down and they start talking right away. Don't do that.
And if you're playing with a group of players on the regular, even if you don't sort of have like a formal team, it is not a bad idea to try to do a group order for a group set of radios. Get a spare one. Say you're buying 5 Cobra walkie-talkies, right? The additional cost to everyone, if you split to add a 6th one so that you have a spare that will be there for when one of them breaks, is trivial. It's like $5 for everybody. Great. The utility you'll get out of being able to pass someone a working radio when their radio is down is tremendous.
Or if you get paired up with a random who doesn't have a radio, then you can say, here's a spare radio that you can use for this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, again, if you're all buying push-to-talk and you're all buying relatively affordable earpieces, you can also toss them a push-to-talk and an earpiece and go, hey, welcome to our radio for the next game. This will make them tremendously more helpful to you. It'll make everyone feel good. It's very effective.
So in terms of your headset or your PTT or what have you, there's tons of options out there. We'll talk about a few that we have used or we currently use. So in the past, I used to use some sort of like a single earpiece headset. So it would actually like cup over my entire ear, and it had a boom mic that would go in front of my mouth.
Sort of swimmer style one.
Yeah, exactly. And it had a band across the front. You can see them. There are similar ones being used in like Generation Kill and stuff like that. And I liked it for a little while, but what I found is that over the course of hours of playtime, it actually hurt my ear after a while, just having that pressure on the pad all the time. It wasn't super great, and at the end of the day, I wasn't crazy about it. So I actually moved on from that type of headset to an actual like in the ear piece that wraps around the back of your ear, kind of like one of those Secret Service kind of jobbies. And I have a custom molded silicone earpiece that just fits right into my ear, and it's super, super comfortable. In terms of comfort for an extended period, I can have it in all day. It's happened many times to me that I've been wondering where my earpiece is, and it's actually been in my ear the whole time. I forgot that it was there. So it's super, super comfortable. It doesn't pull or anything like that, and it's compatible with my radio. It has just a Kenwood plug and a little PTT that I just talk into, and it can pick me up if I'm, whispering or if I'm talking at a normal indoor voice. I know you use like a Sorden headset, right?
Yeah, so currently I'm using a set of over both ears headphones that have a external audio pickup, so they magnify background noise and mute noise like weapon cracks and stuff. So essentially the idea is that you can hear people sneaking up on you better. I haven't really found that that's a humongous benefit of them, but ultimately what they're there for is I have both ears listening to my radio at all times, and they're really, really comfortable. They do provide an added benefit of preventing me from getting shot in the ears, which is kind of nice because getting shot in the ears really is just extremely unfun. But the big thing for me is they allow me to receive radio traffic extremely clearly with no chance of it being overheard, and they're comfortable enough that I can leave them on all day, right? I've also used one of the swimmer style headsets. I also found that it was just, after a while, I'm like, man, this is not comfortable. I don't want to be wearing it. I tried 8 or 9 little, Secret Service style earpieces, and my head is large and shaped weirdly, so none of them worked for me. They all were just always dangling off somewhere on my kit. So the Sordens are a really, really good option for me. They are set up so that I can't wear a helmet in their current configuration, but that's not really an issue for me anyway, because my head is gigantic. And so sort of the Chinese Repro Airsoft helmet is a complete no-go for me, and the Real Steel ones are sufficiently expensive that I'm not even willing to consider it.
And I mean, fundamentally, you wear a boonie, and that works for you.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly, right?
Totally. I know Chris, for his setup, he has sort of like a shoulder mic, and it has a mini plug so he just plugs in like a regular earpiece for his, I don't know, for his cell phone or whatever, but it's the same sort of principle. Sticks in his ear, he doesn't have to worry too much about it, and if he needs to talk, he just has his push-to-talk right on his shoulder. So you have a lot of different options when it comes to headsets. We've enumerated a few.
We also have a lot of options in terms of like mic options. I know there are a bunch of people who've used sort of throat mics because they find them sort of comfortable and they don't get in the way and they're easy to deal with.
Bottom line though, if you have a radio, and you absolutely should have a radio, you also should have some sort of headset and microphone so that you can use it in a more covert way and an easier way as well. Because it's not just about being sneaky. It's not just about sort of being able to hear stuff without other people hearing it. But it's also about not having to fumble in your pockets every time you need to use your radio.
Yeah, it's the same thing that we've talked about a number of times. You want everything to be where it is all the time, consistently. You don't want to have to go looking for your handgun to draw it if you need your handgun. You likewise do not ever want to have to go looking for your push-to-talk. You don't want to have to go looking for your radio, right? If you're like, oh man, I need my radio, and you don't have a push-to-talk, and you have to fumble around to get it out of something, for the entire time that you're doing that, you're not paying attention to the battlefield effectively, you're not paying attention to, what's downrange of you effectively, and you're not putting down fire effectively. So you may be doing something that is ultimately tremendously useful, communicating with your team, but the steps you have to take to do it are likely as not going to get you shot and therefore prevent you from being helpful in the first place.
And as a corollary to that, where you put your radio on your kit is also extremely important. We've talked about it before. But if you have your radio on your back and something happens and you need to change frequency, or your battery died and you were smart and you brought a spare radio battery so you got to swap it out mid-game, if you can't reach the radio yourself and you're by yourself, guess what? That's useless.
Yeah, I mean, speaking as the guy who used to run the radio on his back, we've had games at Fields where the refs switched to our channel and we had to get off of it. And having that happen while I'm by myself, especially because at the time I was wearing a Cyraz, so I'm a couple of minutes of taking off vest to get to my radio, to change the frequency on my radio. That's completely unhelpful.
Yeah.
Right? So you need to be mindful of where you store your radio. You need to be mindful of where you put your PTT. If you are a right-handed shooter, you don't want to put your PTT necessarily on your right shoulder where you're going to be tapping it with your gun every time you bring your rifle up. I tried that for a while and found that it was terrible, so I moved it back to my left shoulder, which is definitely a much better place to keep it for me. You need to make sure you buy an earpiece that stays in your ears, right? If your teammates are trying to communicate with you and you don't have an earpiece in because it fell out because you were moving around, you're no longer on your comms.
Yeah.
And the radio, the push-to-talk, the headset that you've paid money for are all useless. And that's a big part of why I switched to the over-ear headset. I kept losing my little earpiece, and I might as well not have had a radio.
Yeah, I had the same problem when I switched to the Secret Service style sort of earpiece as well. It kept falling out and it wasn't very comfortable. So my recommendation, if you are looking at getting the Secret Service style earpiece, is to get a more molded custom silicone earpiece. They don't have to be custom made for you, but you can find them online very easily. They're super inexpensive, but they just replace that little white plastic bit that just fits in your ear. It's much, much more comfortable to wear for a long period of time. And because of the way it actually fits in your ear, it's never going to fall out unless you haul it out yourself or it got stuck in a branch or something. But unless you actually try and get it out, it's not going to fall out no matter how much you're running. That improved my comfort and the usability of that for me tremendously. So I highly, highly recommend giving that a go.
And if memory serves, those typically come in like a 4-pack with a few different sizes. You can get one that fits you out of one order as well.
And for left and right ears too, depending on which side you want to wear. Because you know that's another thing you can consider as well, is like Pat was saying, if you have your PTT on your right side but it's constantly bumping into your stock and you switch it to the left side, and you're using it like an inner ear, like the type of earpiece that I use, you need to make sure you switch the silicone earbud, because otherwise it's not going to fit, right?
Yeah, and you want to make sure that it is sort of not cross-connected across your entire kit in the way and just messing up everything on you. You have to be mindful of the way you're setting it up so that it doesn't become a detriment or cease to function for you while you're in the field, while you're playing. Likewise, you want to make sure that you're buying a decent push-to-talk and a decent headset. They don't need to be super expensive. They need to stay on. The cost is really, irrelevant. Like, you can buy a $300 headset that doesn't stay on. If it doesn't stay on, it's worthless.
You also want to consider, I know Chris went through several of his little shoulder speakers because they kept getting wet from playing in the mist and the fog and rain and stuff, and they just were not built to get wet at all. Chris is an electrical engineer. He easily could have taken them apart, which he did, and it's just they're busted, right? So you want to make sure you're getting something that's weather resistant if you're going to be playing in conditions where it does get wet, which, it certainly could happen. The last thing I want to mention as an honorable mention is years ago, I used to run a telephone handset as my primary form of communication.
And it was so cool looking. It is super badass. I love it. But
it absolutely was great. Like I had on my plate carrier, I had basically like this black telephone receiver on like a cord. It's exactly like you see in the movies, like when they're talking on, like military guys are talking on their big old pack radios and stuff. And it was awesome, but it also was not great. So this is a really good example of a piece of kit that was super cool, super fun to use, but very not practical. And a couple of reasons for that. Number one is it was just a speaker. So anyone who talked to me through it, it would just come right out. Like I wasn't hearing it in my ear. Everyone was listening to me, right? And then secondly, in order for me to talk, I had to remove it from my kit and then put it up to my mouth, just like I'm talking over the phone. Well, that would certainly look cool, and I know there's a couple of pictures of me that are really cool with me just talking on the phone while directing traffic, basically, and that's super fun to think about. But in practicality, it was more of a pain than anything else, which is why I moved to sort of those inner, on the side or with the inner ear Secret Service style, just because it frees up my hand to just interact with my PTT and not have to do anything else. So it's an honorable mention because it's cool, but certainly not something that I would recommend.
And it's good that he no longer has to hang up his PTT back on his vest when he's done talking on it as well.
Totally.
That was probably an encumbrance.
So, guys, accuracy, brevity, clarity. ABC, right? Remember the ABCs of communication. Whether you're using your hand signals, whether you're using your voice, whether you're using your radio, you need to be accurate, you need to be brief, you need to be clear. In other words, the people who you're talking to need to understand what you're getting on with, right? They need to understand what you're trying to communicate, why it's important, what action is required. And if you can do that with your hands, or you can do that with your voice, or you do it over the radio, then you can be a successful communicator. If you do all of those things, and on top of that, you get a radio, you will be in a much better place to be effective for your team on the field and to help ensure success at the end of the day.
Yeah, you've instantly become an order of magnitude more useful as a member of your team, whether that's, a formal team or just the group of people you're currently playing with.
So thank you so much for tuning into this episode. We hope you found it entertaining and useful. If you have any recommendations for the type of radios that you use, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll talk to you next time.
Have a good week, guys.